Imagine walking into a luxury dressing room in 1984. Van Halen, the biggest rock band on the planet, has just arrived. But instead of celebrating, David Lee Roth is screaming. He's pointing at a small plastic bowl on the table. Among the hundreds of colorful candies, he found the one thing that wasn't supposed to be there. A single brown M&M. What happened next became the stuff of rock and roll legend. Roth allegedly trashed the room, smashed the furniture, caused thousands of dollars in damages, all because of a tiny piece of chocolate. For decades, this story was used as the ultimate proof that rock stars were spoiled. Out-of-touch divas who cared more about their snacks than their music. The press called it a temper tantrum. Promoters called it a nightmare. But as the band's 53-page legal contract sat backstage, a much darker reality was hidden in the fine print. Today, we're looking past the ego and the excess to reveal the life-saving logic behind the most eccentric demand in music history. This wasn't about candy, it was about survival. To understand the M&M rule, you first have to understand the sheer scale of a Van Halen production. By 1984, they weren't just playing concerts. They were deploying a massive industrial operation. While most bands at the time traveled with 3 trucks of equipment, Van Halen showed up with 9. They were the first band to take a full-scale stadium production into small-town arenas. We are talking about thousands of pounds of lighting rigs, massive speakers, and pyrotechnics that required enormous amounts of electricity. The floor of a standard basketball arena wasn't designed to hold that kind of weight. In many of these venues, the technical crews were used to much smaller shows. They would glance at the contract, see a famous rock band name, and assume it was just business as usual. But ignoring the details with Van Halen was a recipe for disaster. If a single structural beam was misplaced or a power line was overloaded, the entire stage could collapse, potentially killing the band and hundreds of fans in the front row. The stakes were incredibly high, and the band knew they couldn't trust a local promoter's word that everything was fine. Deep inside the massive stack of paperwork that every concert promoter had to sign was a section titled Munchies. It looked like a list of typical rock star demands: crackers, cheeses, and various drinks. But buried at number 126 was the trap. It specifically demanded M&Ms, but with one absolute condition. There were to be no brown candies in the bowl. If even a single brown M&M was found, the band reserved the right to cancel the entire show at the promoter's expense, with full payment guaranteed to Van Halen. To the local organizers, this seemed like the ultimate ego trip. They laughed about it behind the band's back, calling them divas and lunatics. They couldn't understand why a multi-million-dollar production would care about the color of a chocolate button, but they were missing the point entirely. This wasn't about the candy. It was a test of professional literacy. The M&Ms were the canary in the coal mine. It was the simplest way to answer one terrifying question. Did the person in charge of our safety actually read the instructions? David Lee Roth later explained that the M&M clause was a brilliant psychological tool. He called it a check line. When the band arrived at a new venue, the first thing Roth would do was walk backstage and look at the candy bowl. If he saw brown M&Ms, he knew immediately that the promoter had been lazy. It was a visual red flag. In his mind, the logic was simple. If they ignored a small detail like the color of the candy, they had almost certainly ignored the big details that actually mattered. He would immediately order a full technical audit of the entire stage. He would check the weight-bearing bolts, the electrical grounding, and the structural integrity of the rafters. Every single time they found brown M&Ms, they also found massive technical errors that could have caused a catastrophe. The diva tantrum everyone saw in the press was actually a calculated reaction. It was the sound of a man realizing his life was in danger because someone hadn't done their job. The bowl of candy wasn't for eating. It was a life-saving diagnostic tool. The most famous example of this rule in action happened at a show in Pueblo, Colorado. When the band arrived at the university's basketball arena, David Lee Roth spotted brown M&Ms in the dressing room. He went into a controlled rage, causing about $12,000 in damage to the room. The media went wild, painting him as a monster. But the technical audit that followed proved he was right to be terrified. The local promoters had completely ignored the weight specifications for the stage. Van Halen's equipment was so heavy that it was literally sinking through the floor of the arena. The stage was on the verge of collapsing into the building's substructure, which would have caused a massive electrical fire and potentially brought down the entire ceiling. The damage to the dressing room was nothing compared to the catastrophe that was avoided. The brown M&Ms didn't cause the tantrum. They were the alarm bells that saved the band, the crew, and thousands of fans from a structural collapse. In that moment, the most ridiculous demand in rock history became the most professional move of their career. Van Halen didn't just change the sound of rock and roll. They changed the way the world treats live events. Today, their legendary M&M clause is taught in business schools and engineering courses as the ultimate example of attention to detail. It proved that in any high-stakes environment, the smallest oversight can be a warning sign of a much bigger disaster. The next time you hear a story about a rock star's crazy demands, remember David Lee Roth and his bowl of candy? It wasn't a diva. He was a leader who knew that his team's lives depended on every single word of a 53-page contract. They turned a piece of chocolate into a life-saving diagnostic tool, proving that being a professional means never, ever skipping the fine print. So, what's the most ridiculous thing you've ever heard a celebrity demand? Was it just an ego trip, or was there a hidden genius behind it? Let us know in the comments, and if you want more deep dives into the secret history of rock and roll, make sure to subscribe.